Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 186. It's time for Anti-Racism with Love with Chloé Valdary. Activist and author Chloé Valdary is a diversity and anti-racism trainer with a refreshingly loving approach. This week, this episode will release on Valentine's Day, so I am encouraging us to approach our ensembles, our classes, our colleagues and our organizations, even our neighbors and friends, with agape love. In music education, we have a very popular and important euphemism. We talk a lot about and post a lot about how we want our students to see themselves in the music or in the ensembles that they watch, based on finding people that they look like in those ensembles or that they look like the composer. And I do find that this type of representation is important for kids, to see people that resemble themselves doing a thing. That does matter. But what we don't hear enough is I want my students to learn to see themselves in everyone. I want my students to learn to see themselves in all of the music that we learn, because this would be an introspective approach, which is echoed in Chloé's fascinating brand of anti-racism. James Baldwin said that I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. One of the core premises that Chloé likes to communicate is that if you can't apply the principle James Baldwin describes here to yourself, then it will not have any value in healing the rifts between us. If you only see it as a principle that applies to others, we will never enter important conversations as equals. She trains, teaches, and advocates for a type of conversation about diversity in schools, groups, and organizations that starts with introspection and search for common humanity. You're not going to want to miss a minute of this deep philosophical conversation. I am really excited to announce, after many requests, there is now a Choralosophy merch store. All you need to do is go to the website, choralosophy.com, look for the shop button in the top. You can find Literacy is Equity shirts and sweatshirts and signs for your room. You can find the Thank You for Your Mistake signs, which I love to put on the wall of a classroom, as well as a variety of other show designs. And you can sport your Choralosopher status by going to choralosophy.com/shop and checking out the store there. Be sure to listen, comment, and share your related experiences on this episode when you see it posted on social media. You can go to the Choralosopher's Facebook page, and of course on choralosophy.substack.com. You can also join in the conversations there. Stick around. One of the best ways that you can scratch your back and scratch mine at the same time is to enter Choralosophy at checkout. When you go to sitereadingfactory.com once or multiple times per year, however many it is that you do to renew your membership, your students' memberships. Also, when you get sheet music at graphitepublishing.com and endeavormusicpublishing.com, you can enter Choralosophy at checkout on those websites and save as well. And of course, getting the best choral folders on the market at mymusicfolders.com allows you to enter Choralosophy at checkout to save at all of those great vendors. Are you tired of managing multiple platforms to sell tickets, fundraise, and market your performances? Look no further than Ludus.com, an all-in-one solution that's easy to use and free to your organization. With Ludus, you'll have access to a suite of tools and resources specifically designed for the performing arts. From ticket sales to merchandise and fundraising, Ludus has got you covered. So why not give it a try? Save time, money, and resources. Choralosophy listeners can go to ludus.com/Choralosophy for an upgrade for free to their marketing suite. Patreon members really keep this show going financially every month, making sure all the costs are covered out of pocket. But they also get access to my Google folder of goodies, the private podcast feed. They find out who's coming on the show ahead of time, and a variety of other fun little conversations that we're able to have over on the Patreon page. The producers and inner circle at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, Jonah Clixbull, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, DF, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I am here with Chloé Valdary, and we are going to be talking about, among other things, are there better ways to approach our conflicts, our internal struggles, our workplace struggles, our in-school struggles around identity, diversity, with love? Can we approach all those things with love? Of course, listeners to this show know that this is something we talk about a lot. This is something we want to achieve, and Chloé is out there doing this as her job. So Chloé, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the pod.
That's great. I'm excited to learn more about your programs and the types of ideas that you go out and teach people. But first, let's just learn a little bit about you. Who are you? Who was little Chloe, and then how did little Chloe become doing all the things that big Chloe's doing?
So I'm Chloe. I'm from New Orleans. I'm 30 years old. I was and remain a nerd as a child, and I'm also a nerd as an adult. Super, super intellectually driven, driven by big ideas. Grew up in a religious home that was equal parts curiosity, equal parts dogmatism. A lot of people, wonder how that can happen, but the human experience is vast and complex, multifaceted, and I was exposed to that reality through my upbringing. Grew up in a house of people who were very much interested in the origin of things. Grew up in a Christian home that didn't observe Christian holidays. So instead of observing Christmas by putting up a Christmas tree every December 25th and having gifts, my family spent Christmas reading documents about Emperor Constantine and the Roman Catholic Church and how it transformed ancient Roman cultural holidays into what is now known as Christmas. Same for festivals like Halloween, Easter, etc. Grew up observing instead of Jewish cultural things, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover. So my sense of time and my sense of the calendar was shaped by that reality. I had an insider outsider relationship to all things, constantly trying to prove I was right. Part of the inferiority superiority complex I developed as a child, part of the defensive mechanisms I developed as a child. Was also exposed to great art, great music. Grew up in a home full of music, full of dance. Very much inspired by the arts. Became more of a musician later in life, aka in my late 20s. So
Okay.
I play guitar. I love to sing. I love to dance. I've always loved to dance. So that is a little bit about me.
That's awesome. I have a connection with you already. Then your upbringing in the religious aspect it sounds very much like my wife. She was raised.
Okay.
In fact, what was the name of the church, if you don't mind me asking?
It was called the Intercontinental Church of God, which is a generic name. So,
Okay, this is really funny because my wife was grew up in the Worldwide Church of God, which I think has a similar
there's
like
probably overlap. Yeah.
family tree in terms of where they came from, because almost identical.
Yeah.
Like she sang in her choir at the school, for example, when she was in high school, and anytime they sang anything about any holidays at all, even if it was not a sacred song, she had to
Hmm.
like put her folder down, walk off the stage, wait till that song was over, and then walk back on. Patriotic songs too,
Yes.
she wasn't allowed to sing.
Oh, that I wasn't raised that way. We're actually deeply patriotic, so it might not have been the same church. But that's interesting. Probably
Yeah.
overlap for sure.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, birthdays, Christmas, Easter. She wasn't
Mm,
allowed to do any of that stuff. It was all
yeah.
kind of the Old Testament holidays. But that's really interesting. And one of the things that I find interesting too about that is, of course, you deal now and you work in areas of anti-racism training, diversity
Yep.
training, belonging training. Um, to me, that even that story about our religious upbringings and how they're
Mm,
different. I grew up in a very conservative Christian, very
mm,
fundamentalist. We were all good with the Christmas and Easter and stuff,
sure.
but it was very fundamentalist, and about the ways in which we are diverse that you can't see.
Mm,
You can't see that by looking at somebody.
yeah.
That, for example, my wife and I are both, Caucasian or
Mhm.
racialized as white in America. She's
Mhm.
a different ethnicity than I am. She's
Mm,
her ancestry is Czech,
mm,
and I have mostly German, kind of German and Celtic ethnicity, which are two different ethnicities. But
mhm.
she has more religious upbringing in common with you than she does
Mm.
with me, and people would immediately look at all three of us and say, "Well, those two have a lot in common."
Right. Right.
You know what? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that something that you encounter? Just that the diversity of diversities, so to speak, in your work?
Well, we say to people who assume that let's say organizations have an all-white staff, they'll just assume there's no diversity there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like one of the assumptions that we try to get people to challenge by engaging with our work. It's like that assumption in and of itself suggests that for a lot of people, diversity is literally skin deep, and they're not thinking about diversity in a sophisticated way, and they're assuming certain things that have been said about diversity, what it is, how it works. They just take it at face value. But I say to people, like, by the time you finish engaging with us, you'll realize that, if you look at this picture of the all white staff, were actually wrong about, or in your assumptions that there was no diversity to be found here. You're just like misunderstanding what diversity is fundamentally.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. So, of course, when you say work with us, so before we get too far into this
Sure.
conversation, who is us? You have a company that
Yes.
provides these types of trainings for folks. So why don't you tell us about that? Who is the company? What kind of work do you do?
Yeah, so the name of the company is called The Theory of Enchantment. We provide diversity and inclusion practices, really, to organizations. We also do so on a consumer level as well, but we are mostly a B2B company, so we mostly sell to other businesses that are looking to bring in a practice of inclusion and belonging to increase trust, increase things like retention, talent, etc., etc. It's me, my partner, Peter Stein. And then we have two folks on admin. So we're a pretty small organization. And we basically start with the understanding that when it comes to supremacy or superiority complexes, which is, I think, something that a lot of people, I think, would ultimately agree are harmful. Uh, we start with the psychological premise that those are defensive mechanisms that we as human beings reach for in order to feel good about ourselves whenever we're insecure. And insecurity is just a part of the human experience. We are all going to have moments of insecurity. And so the question becomes, how can we, first of all, become aware of the feelings of insecurity, not feel stigma around insecurity or shame because that tends to make it worse, and then reach for other practices and habits so that we can actually get in a deeper relationship with it without projecting it onto other people as a defensive mechanism.
Yeah.
And so that's like starting point number one. And then starting point, I would say, like, simultaneous to that is we have three principles: treat people like human beings, not political abstractions; criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy; try to root everything you do in love and compassion. So we give people practices to embody those principles so that when they feel insecurity, they don't need to project it onto another human being in order to feel good about themselves or as a coping mechanism. They can actually just get a deeper relationship with it and understand it as a part of what it means to be human.
Yeah. So, and it's let me kind of summarize that, and I want you to always, as long as we're talking, if I say something wrong, please tell me. Just because I'm the host doesn't mean that you
Sure.
have to smile and nod. Okay,
Yeah.
so I don't want to put words in your mouth. So it sounds like what you're saying is you're offering an anti-racism and diversity training that, unlike a lot of the really popular ones that I have to deal with in my school district, for example, because I'm a teacher, most of the folks in my audience are teachers, and like
Hmm.
the ones that are very common in popular culture, you're taking an approach unlike theirs that starts at the systemic level and
Hmm.
projects systemic issues down onto the individual. And instead, you're starting at the individual and saying, we need to, in order for us to affect the systems at large,
Hmm.
we have to start inside, work out, deal with the things that are causing us to reach out and lash out by recognizing that others have those same issues within them as well.
So I would agree 95%. I would just disagree a little bit
Okay.
on a semantic point, which
Yeah.
is we suggest that what we're doing is actually the truly on a systemic level, whereas people who use the term systemic to mean what you just described are misusing the word, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
Like
Go.
the the word radical actually means at the root. It's a gardening word. And what we're trying to do is get at the root of the problem, which is, or the challenge, let's say, which is the human system. And the human system is the system from which all of these other systems emerge.
Yeah.
So it is irrelevant or unsustainable, let's say, to try to change a system merely from the top down without having an approach that's working simultaneously that is from the bottom up. which is to say that is engaging the human system that affects all the other systems. And here's the thing, the human system is actually the most difficult system to change because it is the most complex system in the known universe. Like all of us are walking around with brains. Our brains are the most complex system in the known universe. It includes the limbic system, right? Which puts us into fight or flight mode whenever we are in a feeling of fear or insecurity, right? So like how do you change that? Well, you have to actually be engaging in a habitual practice that leads to behavior change over time. It's not enough for me to give you a PowerPoint, although I promise you I can give you a very riveting one that's better than a lot of the other ones out there, right? And that'll be great as a starting point, but in order to affect change over time, we are creatures of habit, right? And so we have to be engaged in a habit oriented approach. But to sort of put a bow on the issue, we are a systemic organization. We just start with the most complex system in the known universe, which is the human being.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I absolutely I love that way that you just made that distinction. And one of the other things you said earlier too in your explanation of your philosophy with theory of enchantment is that supremacy frameworks, or let's just call it, let's just say racism as an
Sure.
example of one
Sure.
of many supremacy frameworks, is ultimately stems from an insecurity. And so
Yes.
I want to kind of hash that out. And again, correct me if you think I get this wrong. But so let's say I have some kind of an internal insecurity inside of me that
Mm-hmm.
causes me to need to place myself above others, and because I don't think that there's enough value in my own because of my own insecurities, I need to latch myself onto a group that I
Mm-hmm.
can point to that group's qualities and then say, look at us, we're better than you. And
Mm-hmm.
that essentially stems from that, or that's how insecurity within an individual person might turn into racism,
Mm-hmm.
because I need to attach myself to, say, let's say the accomplishments of other people who look like me. And that's really common with white racists, is they will
Sure.
list all the really fancy like accomplishments of scientists and scholars, and like see
Sure.
what we white people did. And of course then they'll ignore that, white is not an ethnicity, and there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of types of people, right? You so is that, am I onto something there, or
You're you're definitely onto something. I'm gonna break it down even further.
great.
Imagine, I'm just making this up. Imagine that you were born into an alcoholic family
Okay.
and you experienced insecurity as a result. Literally, your needs were not being met because of the scarcity that you experienced being born into that family. You didn't have the proper tools to deal with that scarcity. So for whatever reason, you found yourself attracted to the white power movement because you were actually having there was a need that was not met in your lived experience, and so you filled that by doing what in psychology is called splitting. And splitting is a term that basically means when you see in the context of racism, all the people who look like you are good, all the people who don't look like you are bad, right?
Mm,
And that's an easy, simple heuristic that gives you a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic life, right? In an
mhm.
otherwise chaotic world, which you are growing up in because you have been born into a family of scarcity, right? So it's everything that you just said, but it's more poignant in the sense that it's in a way harder to solve for because it's not just like you were attracted to some ideological thing. You were attracted to some ideological thing because there was a real pain point in your life that wasn't being addressed, that was
Yeah.
out of your control,
Yeah.
right? So that is happening on so many micro levels, and then it scales up to the macro level.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. And so one of those other heuristics, really simplified, that we run into a lot with people, is that there are really just two types of people. There are oppressors
Sure.
and there are oppressed people.
Right.
And really the project is to figure out which category someone falls in, and we need to figure that out as quickly as possible. And of course, one of the quickest ways to do that is if based on what they look like. And so maybe somebody who's really attached to that framework, and in
Mm-hmm.
education, I will tell you that that framework is
Mm.
extremely popular.
Sure. Yeah.
And this my show is one of a few that maybe I could count on one or two hands in the education sphere that reaches the audience the size that we do
Hmm.
that will challenge these ideas
Hmm.
because it's scary uh,
Sure.
to
Sure.
challenge these ideas. But and so my question would be, if somebody, let's say somebody's listening to that last little couple minutes that you just explained, kind of the roots of internal pain that might cause racism. If somebody's
Hmm.
getting has this oppressor versus oppressed dichotomy, and those are the only two choices, they might hear you say, "Wait, hold on. It sounds like you're describing the racist as the victim. Are you
Mm-hmm.
saying we should look at that racist person with some type of the same type of compassion we would look at a victim of other things? No, they're the oppressor. They're the enemy. Well,
Hmm.
how would you respond to that type of a criticism?
One of the great educations that I have received has been in my sort of exposure to the world of psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you're familiar at all with this world, or if you've dove in at all. But if you haven't, one of the things that the world of psychedelics has taught me is the multiplicity, or the again, the complex nature of reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I begin to answer your question with that because I think it's important that people understand that a human being contains multitudes, right? It is possible, and in fact, highly probable, actually, given the complexity of the human species, for a human being to be both an oppressor and a victim at the same time.
There you go.
One does not negate or preclude the other,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that actually whether it's psychedelics, whether it's art, whether it's, there are even aspects of religion, I think, that lend itself to revealing to human beings this particular profound truth. It's that we contain multitudes. And so, yes, an oppressor can simultaneously be a victim. Yes, a victim can simultaneously be an oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, an oppressed can simultaneously be an oppressor, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not this either or binary that we like to assume that's how the world works. And the reason why we are assuming that's the way the world works is because we don't know how to deal with complexity, right? We don't have the tools to deal with complexity. We don't have the educational system, quite frankly, that teaches us how to deal with complexity. And so we just collapse things into these easy binaries.
Yeah.
Last thing
No.
I'll say,
Go ahead.
last thing I'll say about that, and I talked about this in a thing earlier today, actually. James Baldwin has this really radical observation that he gives in his debate with William F. Buckley in 1965 at the University of Cambridge, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, if you think about the racist Alabama sheriff, right, who is racist, like through and through, and a purveyor of the values of Jim Crow, and not only racist, but probably has participated in lynchings, like really, really bad behavior, right? He says, presumably, this is a man who loves his wife and loves his children and loves to get drunk just like I do, and he doesn't know what drives him to do what he does. He doesn't know what drives him to pick up the cattle prod and press it against a woman's breasts. And here comes the radical part. What he has done, James Baldwin says, to the woman is ghastly. But what has happened to him, such that he would even do that, is in some ways far worse.
Mm. My goodness. Yeah, I can't imagine someone saying that today.
Right, right.
Yeah, but that's James Baldwin.
That's James Baldwin.
Yep, yep. And I've watched that debate before as well. It's pretty powerful. I highly recommend anyone listening go look that up. It's a
Yeah.
pretty powerful conversation. Yes, that's really interesting. And I was thinking earlier, just as you talk about all of this and the way that you approach these things. I mentioned before that in education, this type of framework is it really is pretty binary now. And
Hmm.
before you said part of it is because we can't see the complexity, and you're right. And now I'll push back on you a little bit. I
Sure.
think it's partly that we can't see the complexity. That's at the human level. But in
Hmm.
education, I can tell you for sure, it's also because we have been taught to think of it that way. For
Okay.
example,
Sure.
as in, it's not that we can't see it; it's we've been taught to not see it,
Mm.
and that is a difference. So, for example, one of the more influential books in my field is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire.
Mm.
Every,
Sure.
every single one of us in an education class, when we get certified to teach, has to read Freire at some
Mm.
point, and you find it cited in tons and tons of papers. I'm a huge nerd in education world, and I have my email set to go out and find and have emailed to me dissertations of people doing research in education, so that I can kind of keep up, because I'm old, so I've been teaching a long time. I want to see what research is coming out, and that book and that way of thinking, which is essentially to think of students in terms of oppressed, and in many ways even teaches us to think of ourselves, the teachers, as the oppressors, which
Mm.
is, you
Mm.
know, like
Yeah.
just bizarre, especially because again, you're putting labels of these binary labels on humans.
Sure.
And so, and I was thinking earlier too, as you were talking about how, yes, it's not a binary. Yes, oppressors can be victims and vice versa, and all that, which was really good. But then I would also say too, in certain places, times, and contexts, people can be neither of those things.
Yes, of course. Yes.
There is such a thing as neutral, despite what
Yeah.
Ibram Kendi would say. There is
Yeah.
such a thing as neutral. You can be just like doing neither at that moment,
Yeah. Of
and
course.
then and later fall into other situations that cause you to act out or be oppressed or whatever. So it's interesting. And so I wonder. I'm interested. I kind of shared already just now what I see in education that's causing some of these misunderstandings, is what I would call them.
Hmm.
But what is your idea about why there aren't more of your types of trainings out there, and why there's more of the Freire style?
Um, that's a good question, and also very good point that you brought that up. I forgot who said it, but someone said, "Be neither a master nor a slave."
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you don't have to fall into either of those categories actually, and to suggest that oppressor, oppressed, master, slave are the only categories that human beings fall into is to really denigrate the human being and the human condition, and reduce it to a very poor existence, actually. So I thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of where I think the attraction to these more toxic forms of anti-racism come from, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I can sort of hypothesize that we tend to be super, um in a way we're kind of like addicted to conflict. And what do I mean by this? I want to sort of tease this out by using social media as a kind of reference point.
Okay.
The algorithms on social media are designed, and my friend Tobias Rose Stockwell wrote an incredible book about this called Outrage Machine. He used to work in Facebook and for tech, so he's seen it. The algorithms are designed in such a way to program to be outraged all the time,
Yep.
and to condition us to be rewarded for promoting things that will outrage other people. And so the structures on social media are set up so that we're incentivized to just be angry all the time. And I do wonder, I don't know the answer to this, but I do wonder, given the pervasive nature of how widespread these social media algorithms are, how does that impact the conversation in education? Because you can imagine if an educational institution needs to get funding, right? Let's say it's a grantee for nonprofit organization, and in order to demonstrate its metrics, it has to prove that it has X amount of followers on social media and it's engaging them. But
Mm-hmm.
what actually engages them the most, which means keeps their eyeballs on the page, is promoting outrageous, divisive content. You can see how that structure, that system, would be designed to reward folks who would. I won't say that there's anything necessarily wrong with uh uh reading or talking about pedagogy of the oppressed, but if you're only talking about that, if you're not presenting another option as a viable and dissonant, response to it, that's obviously a problem. So I do think there's something to be said about the social media algorithms and how, because they affect all of the structures that we're talking about, and how they could incentivize educational institutions to promote the types of things that you're talking about over a theory of enchantment. At the same time, I do think there's growing demand for theory of enchantment
Good.
and organizations like ours. I think people are obviously getting fed up about, over being disparaged because of their skin color, or because of, whatever. I do worry about overcorrection, or which I do see in certain circles.
Yep.
Um, but I do think that the demand for theory of enchantment is going to grow.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the overcorrection problem because this is actually something that um, I, when I started to see the popularity 5, 6, 7 years ago of this extremely identity focused, binary thinking type of social justice activism that we are kind of discussing, becoming more and more popular, ubiquitous everywhere.
Hmm.
That actually was my first thought. Not whether or
Yeah.
not I think it would work, but but whether or not, and the inevitability that what that would cause is people reacting so negatively to it that we almost, as a society, then later become more racist.
Yes.
In other words,
Yes.
like even just thinking about the way that how acceptable it is to talk about white straight males in
Right.
just the most awful, awful terms,
Right.
and essentializing us essentially down to our very DNA,
Yeah.
as related to all of the worst things that have ever happened in the history of the planet.
Right.
Fast forward a generation, and suddenly you've got a bunch of kids raised to have to run into a corner to be with other people who are just like them,
Right.
and then they're going to have meetings,
Right.
metaphorically,
Yeah.
metaphorically, and then
Yeah.
they, you know what I mean. And then
Yeah.
a lot of the really terrible movements in human history have come from people who feel backed into a corner,
Hmm.
and like you were saying earlier, then feel wounded by that
Yeah.
rejection from society and become very bitter about it and seek to lash back.
Right.
And I feel like, and this would be another way to think about this. I want to see what you think. Is that a lot of what kind of underpins some of this other brand? I'm just going to call it the other brand, not
Sure.
Chloe's brand, the other
Yeah.
brand of social
Yeah.
justice training and diversity training, anti-racism training, is built around what the terms that get used a lot, like systems of power, is one of their
Hmm. Hmm.
favorite terms, right?
Hmm.
And so here's how I think of that. There absolutely have been systems of power throughout history that have been used to oppress people.
Hmm.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody would deny that. Whereas we are now in a situation where there is a school of thought that says the answer to that is to grab control of those systems of power so that we can use them for good.
Hmm.
In other words, that's how they would think of it. And then I sit here and I look at that and I think, well, wait a minute, hold on, that's not the only option. What if we
Hmm.
tried to dismantle the power structure altogether so that we are equals?
Hmm.
Right?
Sure.
Thoughts about that?
So I do suppose that if I were still manning the other brand, I would articulate it the way that you have articulated it. But I don't actually hear folks saying we need to grab the systems of power so that we might use it for good. I hear people saying we need to grab systems of power and power is all that matters, essentially. And
Mm.
anything is justified, really, as long as we have power. I don't even hear people aspiring to do good. Right?
There
So,
does seem to be a lot of vengeance and resentment in that
yeah.
brand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That being said, you know, I I would ask you to expound on what you mean by that. What you mean in terms of your solution.
You mean of the using the systems for good?
No, no, grabbing systems of power, dismantling them, and then what?
So I guess really, yeah, that's a good question. So the way I think of it is that one of the most dangerous things in human the extremely complicated human system you referenced before
Yeah.
is when power in general, as in
Hmm.
I'm just going to define it very simply, which is group of people or person who can make you do something that you don't want to do.
Sure.
through whatever means that is that the more consolidated that power becomes in
Mm-hmm.
small numbers of hands, the
Mm-hmm.
more dangerous it becomes,
Okay.
because people then don't feel any check and balance to their power.
Sure.
And so, of course, just to keep the example on racism, let's say racism in the United States and Jim Crow, which we referenced earlier, we had relatively small groups of people who
Mm-hmm.
are able to set the laws and the rules in a certain locality, and that grip on power is so consolidated that very little can change. And
Yeah.
we had to go through a whole war about it, in
Yeah.
the 1800s and
Yeah.
slavery, for example, right? And whereas when power systems are dismantled, and I would maybe dismantled is not the best word because it means different things to different people, but
Sure.
deconsolidated,
Sure. Do you mean
diffused.
like distributed?
Yes, more
Yeah.
evenly
Distributed
distributed.
power. Yeah.
So I've
Yeah.
got power. I've got certain, but you can't have human society with no power anywhere.
Right.
But like it's I don't. It's less consolidated. Yeah, that I think that's how I would say it. More evenly distributed.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, one of the ironies of so Ibram Kendi wrote a piece in the Atlantic I want to say 2 years ago, arguing that folks who disagreed with Brown versus the Board of Education or who wanted to dismantle Brown versus Board of Education were racists, bigots. But what he failed to understand was that the father of critical race theory, who actually fought for Brown versus the Board of Education, came out against Brown versus Board of Education later. I
Uh
just think
huh.
that's so funny because
Yeah.
he argued against it in service of precisely what you're arguing for, which was more distributed power. We argue that Brown versus the Board of Education actually took power out of the hands of families and teachers in a local environment. So I grew up in New Orleans. I went to Langston Hughes Elementary School. I need to fact check this, but I'm pretty sure Langston Hughes Elementary School during the time of Jim Crow was one of those community schools founded by Black teachers and parents, and it was an experience where like everyone in the community was actually involved. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've heard horror stories where you have like school boards that don't actually have any person in the locale or any parents in the locale that are actually part of the school board. So you have this like power mismatch or power dynamic issue. And so what happened with Brown versus the Board of Education with forced busing and all these things was actually in many cases the dismantling of this system where you had families and teachers super involved closely in the running of the school system. And in many cases, the neighborhood revolved around the activity of the school. Right?
Hmm.
This was a dynamic experience. People like to speak about equity in a very narrow way. Right? They're just like quota systems and let's make sure people with this skin color get access to resources without caring about anyone who doesn't have that skin color. But that's not what like the true spirit of equity is about, in my opinion. It's certainly not what it's about in a business context, right? You think
Right.
of equity in a business context, it's like, how can we make sure that everyone has ownership of this process, right?
Hmm.
Because if you have ownership of this process, you'll invest more, right? You will be more willing to take responsibility for it, right? I think like prior to the Industrial Revolution, where there was more of a history of craftsmanship, and like prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was no. I was listening to a podcast. It was interesting about this. There was no distinction between someone who built the thing and owned the thing, if that makes sense. Like there was like this whole system where there were craftsmen who had to build their wares, build their products and services, etc. But they also owned the products and services.
Mm.
So to refer to, let's say, what we would now call capitalists, and to refer to laborers were the same thing. There was no like distinction prior to the Industrial Revolution, which I find interesting. I'm getting off
Yeah.
on a tangent a little bit, but I say all that to say these are just little examples of what I hear when I hear uh, distributed power. with distributed power, more people actually take ownership of the thing itself, more people actually invest in the thing itself, more people take responsibility for the thing itself, and the thing itself actually reflects the locale as opposed to being superimposed from the top, as you said, in an instance where power is consolidated only in the hands of a few.
Right.
Now, I'll say one last thing and then I'll hand it over to you. Maybe two last things. Um, Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century, deeply inspired Dr. King, wrote about this disease that took over Americans. And it's a disease that occurred because of our experience in the Cold War,
Okay.
right? So we are fighting the Soviet Union, right? Stalin and his ilk claim to, they use these terms that now create a situation where some of the things I just said, if you are if you identify as a conservative, red-blooded, Republican, you might hear some of the things I said and think, "Oh no, she's advocating for Soviet-style communism." Right? You might hear some of the things I said and just like, again, easy heuristic, right? That split that we do. It's everyone who looks like me is good, everyone who thinks like me is good, everyone who has the same political opinion as me is good. It's the easy heuristic, the easy binary. And what I would like to suggest to folks to really try as an exercise is to notice that trend. Notice how that tendency emerges within us as human beings
And how easy it is.
and how easy it is to fall
Mhm.
into that, and just get curious about that. That's all. That's
Mhm.
all I would ask. Is get
Yeah.
curious, like where did that come from,
Yeah.
right? So now I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, so I think that's good and a really good analysis. I feel like we just finished a undergrad like criticism course. You and I just like, batted our power analysis back and forth. So let's change gears and let's talk about
Sure,
love.
sure.
Why is love such a core tenet of your brand
Mm.
of diversity training?
Love. So the third principle of the theory of enchantment is root everything you do in love and compassion. This stems in part from the greatest protest movement in American history, namely the Civil Rights Movement, which according to Dr. King, the highest ideal and aim of the Civil Rights Movement was agape, or unconditional love. So agape is a Greek term that comes from the Christian wisdom tradition. It also comes from Greek philosophical tradition, which a lot of people don't talk about that part. But it's this idea, it's a kind of love that generates being itself, in the sense that it's the kind of love that a parent has for a child that, when directed to a child, actually empowers and enables that child to become a full adult.
Hmm.
The reason why we sort of use the language of, and I'm not a parent, I hope one day to be a parent, but the reason why we use the language of raising a child, right? Where does that come from? Like, it's a kind of, it's almost like related to gardening, in the sense that, you plant a seed and you water it and it grows, and in its growth it is raised. So agape love is the kind of unconditional love which, when directed at a human being, or when directed at a part of a human being, right? Let's take like my insecurities, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If I can direct unconditional love towards myself when I am feeling insecure, in the sense that, let's say an insecurity rises and I'm able to say to myself, "Ah, isn't that interesting? Look at that. I felt this when that person talked to me in this tone, because that tone reminded me of my mother's tone, and I was just like thrown back into the past, even though I'm not in the past, I'm in the present moment." But if I can enter into a state of awe, if I can enter into a state of wonder as I watch all of my complexities, not just insecurities, the things I'm the attributes, the qualities I'm grateful for and happy to have, my gifts, my talents, all these things that make me human. If I can enter into a state of wonder and awe and a sensibility of incredible um, appreciation for, and there's a quality of grace in this also,
Mm-hmm.
in what I'm describing. And grace is related to the word gratitude and gratefulness, the ability to give thanks for all that arises within your being. If we can get to that place as human beings, then we will be able to experience others with that same kind of love. And that will, in turn, over time, create what Dr. King called the beloved community. But it takes great work to be able to do that. I think
Mm-hmm.
people take for granted the fact that the civil rights folks, and many of them were teenagers, right? And young adults. Like, it's very, very important to highlight the weight of taking that on. And they were taking on Jim Crow, right? As a reminder of what they were actually trying to dismantle. These were teenagers, these were young adults who were training themselves to love themselves and therefore their neighbor. Their neighbor included the white supremacists, right? So if we can actually engage in a practice where on a regular basis, that is the attitude that through which we see ourselves and therefore our neighbor, we can end up creating that beloved community. But again, that's hard
Yeah.
because it's hard for us to be grateful for the things we like about ourselves, let alone the things we don't like about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
And of
very,
course,
very difficult task.
same thing for others. It's hard. It's very
Yeah,
difficult. Yeah, and maybe even worse. Maybe even harder.
yeah,
Because we don't. We're all the main characters in our own stories, and we tend to have the most sympathy with the protagonist
yes.
in the story. That's a really good explanation. Could we take it now into more out of the theory and into the practice? So when you're doing a
Mhm.
training with the theory of an enchantment, one of your clients, how would this love concept, that third principle of theory of enchantment, how would that come up in a lesson, say, or in a workshop? And what are the different
Mm.
ways that you present that in that type of a setting?
So we have really two different types of services, let's say. We have facilitated workshops, and then we have the Enchanted Games League, which is a version of Dojo, which I know that you've been exposed to. So within the facilitated workshop setting, we call those marathons, they're full day workshops. Um, what is happening is we're giving teams a set of games, which are practices, to do in the course of the facilitation. And each of these games correlate with those principles and they culminate in the third principle. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like by the time you've done all the games that are a part of the first and second principle, you've learned the third principle, essentially. And so games include games like the Who Am I practice. The Who Am I practice is where you put on a timer for 3 minutes and you ask yourself, Who am I? And for every answer that comes to you, you say thank you. And you especially practice saying thank you for those things about yourself that you don't like. And it's hard. Like it's really hard for people. People see how hesitant they are in actually showing themselves gratitude. We also have like stoicism games where people are taught stoicism and taught how to pay attention to how you pay attention. We show them images. We show them triggering images of like politicians that they might not like, right? Or politicians that they might like, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Or images of protests that have happened that represent this position or that position, and we get them to tune in to what is present for them emotionally, and we teach them diaphragmatic breathing and how that like actually changes things. We teach them how like, oh, I just showed you this picture of Donald Trump and you're a liberal, but if I was showing this to a conservative, they would have a very different emotional response than you. Isn't that interesting? How can we get curious about the emotional response? Because again, Stoicism is about paying attention to how you pay attention, right?
Yeah.
You have power over your mind. Realize this, and you will be free. Marcus Aurelius, right? So we have these different practices. We have vulnerability practices that teach people how to identify their positive attributes, their opportunities for growth. They start to see how their positive attributes are actually connected to their opportunities for growth. So in one context, my ability to be really steadfast shows up as stubbornness in another context. It's the same thing, but the context changed, right? We talked about how you could be a victim and an oppressor in the same context, right? So we're telling people about the complex nature of reality, and then we're putting them in situations where they're actually exploring how that shows up for them in real time. So that's a facilitation. And then Enchanted Games League is basically, we'll take a team and they'll be put in a game for either 3 weeks, 6 weeks, or 9 weeks. And the game is very simple. You log onto a platform every day and you do a quest. And the quest is 3 to 6 minutes long, and it's a question. And I just love how those words are related on purpose.
Yep. Yep.
Right? The quest is a question that gets you to deeply engage in why you think the way you think, how you think the way you think. So questions include things like, write about a time where you felt expansive and write about a time where you felt defensive. What was that like? Write about a mindset you got from your parents that you'd like to keep, and write about a mindset you got from your parents that you'd like to let go of. Write about a time you felt superior to another human being. What was that like? Write about a time that you saw an entire group of people as a symbol, whether as a symbol for good or whether as a symbol for bad. Write about it. This is very important practice. Why? Number one, these practices or quests are spaced and repetitive, very similar to the Duolingo model of learning. Science shows that if you have spaced, repetitive learning, that is what actually causes behavior change over time. So you'll get one of those quests. Let's take, write about a time where you felt superior to another human being. You'll get that quest on day 2, and you'll get it on day 5, and you'll get it on day 8, and you'll get it on day 12. Because what that does is, first of all, it destigmatizes the feeling of feeling superior to another human being or to another group of people, because guess what? We all feel that way sometimes. It's a part of what it means to be human, right? If we could actually get used to vulnerably showing up and admitting that to ourselves and to others, that feeling will actually have less of a hold on us, right? We will see it as simply a tendency that is a part of the human species, it's part of my lived experience, and I don't have to be like, I don't have to be oppressed by it, and I don't have to feel like, I need to conquer this. This is one of the, I would say, qualities or an archetype, you might say, of unconditional love, is to be able to hold space. Listen to that metaphor, right? Hold space for what is. And if you actually do that practice on a regular basis with all of these things, they're also like, quests like, you have a judgment of someone, write about the unmet need behind that judgment, right? Like, so for example, if someone's being flaky and I have a need for human connection, that need wasn't being fulfilled. That's why I judged that person in that moment and saw them as this caricature, as this one thing, right? If I can get into the habit of these practices regularly, I will bring that wherever I am. And what will start to happen is when I find myself in a conflict with my coworker, in a conflict with a customer, or in conflict with a family member, or in conflict with a friend, I will be more likely to have a mindset that frames things according to questions, first of all, right? Yeah. I will be way more curious. I'll be way more likely to enter into a state of curiosity and of questing. There's a lot of video game research that went into this as well, but we don't have to talk about that. And I will be more likely to, when I feel that tension, because it's a somatic felt experience, when I feel that sense of defensiveness, I can name it, right? I'll be more likely to name it. That's what's present here for me. Just want to be honest, open, transparent, vulnerable with you, and let's have the conversation. And that in and of itself goes a long way into helping people not simply like get over conflict, right? Because that's not really the goal. It's like, how do we get into deeper relationship with each other in spite of the fact that there is conflict? Yeah. Because there's always going to be conflict. It's a part of the human condition. So that's a long way of answering your question about how we operationalize these principles and these practices.
Yeah, it sounds like we hear a lot about how important it is. Let's again from especially from people who kind of preach the other brand,
Hmm.
of how important it is to have difficult conversations.
Right.
And
Yes.
I've been in a lot of DEI trainings in my life
Mm.
as a teacher, 20 plus years, and they became pretty popular. I would say I started seeing them in education about 12, 13 years ago.
Mm.
And um, I hear a lot of the people say that we're going to have difficult conversations in those trainings. We never
Hmm.
do.
Hmm.
We never do. Nothing like what you just described, which actually sounds difficult, where I'm going to have to look at myself. Like
Yeah.
I'm going to have to look at my own issues, and I don't mean I'm because we are told in those DEI trainings to look at ourselves, but we're told to look not as me, Chris Muntz.
Right.
I'm told to look at me, the white guy,
Right.
which the answer is the same then for the white guy sitting next to me.
Right.
But right, and so this seems actually more like a difficult conversation because in those
Yeah.
trainings we have one conversation where the trainer tells us just how it is,
Yeah.
and then if I'm sitting there disagreeing there, I'm fully aware that my disagreement would not be welcome
Yeah.
if I raised my hand. And so to me what it sounds like is that in a truly introspective type of an approach that you're offering here, that's really where most of our difficult conversations would come from. First is with ourselves. We
Yeah.
we would have very difficult conversations with our own selves because we're all incredibly flawed. And
Yeah.
by looking at ourselves in the way that you just described, and I think this is the point, but you tell me if it's not, is that when we see all of those contradictions in ourselves, we see those flaws in ourselves, we see our own struggles with our own self esteem, with our own motivation, with our own ability to overcome challenges. We are then more likely, if we're trained on it, like you're suggesting, we're more likely to look at another person and
Hmm.
see that thing is those conflicts are probably going on in that person too.
Absolutely.
Is that the goal?
Absolutely. And if we are able to have more compassion for ourselves, we will be able to have more compassion for others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah.
is ultimately the goal.
That's good. That's good. All right. So I want to try to wrap this up this way if we could, because I want
Sure.
you to be able to tell us kind of where to go to access all of these programs. But first, one thing that I'm just curious about before we wrap it up is you mentioned growing up in a house with a lot of music. Well, I'm a musician, I'm a music teacher. And I've
Nice.
seen in some of your materials that you use a lot of pop culture music references in
Hmm.
your training. Can you just give us a few? Like, how do you work music into this?
Yeah, so some of our teachings in the past on, let's say, parental baggage, I've cited John Mayer's song "In the Blood," which is an incredible song that explores parental baggage. Also, "Prodigal Son" by Rationale is a great song. The famous "Landslide" by Fleetwood Mac is a great
Mm-hmm.
song that explores
Mm-hmm.
parental baggage. We use Kendrick Lamar's song "DNA" to explore who am I, right? And every great Disney film, the protagonist at some point is confronted with this question. Like in The Lion King, at the turn of the tide, as Gandalf says in Lord of the Rings, Simba is asked by Rafiki, "Who are you?" Right, and it's in that moment where he has to confront who he is and accept who he is and fully embrace who he is. That's when he remembers he's the king, right, and he needs to go back to Pride Rock and do what he needs to do.
Yeah.
So, we are very aware that there's a reason why we're so attracted to these pop culture sources, right? There's a very profoundly trueness in these pop culture sources, which is why we gravitate towards them like
Mm-hmm.
moths to a flame. And so, part of the theory of enchantment is like if we highlight them and surface them in a different context where we're like, there's a reason why you're paying attention. Pay closer attention.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That if we could do that, then it will make the process of falling in love with this whole human condition that much more easier and tangible.
Yeah.
So, there's lessons that we've had in the past in the more sort of like earlier iterations of theory of enchantment um, which were like longer because I'm a nerd, so I will read things for 45 minutes and like answer a bunch of questions. The average person I've learned doesn't have time for that. But there's lessons where we talk about what exploitation looks like, right? And we'll link to Ursula and The Little Mermaid singing Poor Unfortunate Souls, right? That song is textbook exploitation. She's showing you what it is, right? A person like preys on another person, sees that they're feeling insecure, tells them they could get them what they want, but for a price, right? There's always a price. Poor Unfortunate Souls is a great example of exploitation. Stay in Here from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Another perfect song that shows that power dynamic, right? Power in the hand of one person, exploiting another person. Um, we show how an inability to commune with your own pain can lead to fascism, basically. So we explore like how Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader, right? We
Mm-hmm.
explore how Killmonger becomes Killmonger in Black Panther, right? These are the same patterns. Like these are all human beings going through the
Right.
same patterns. If an inability to commune with their pain, give express their pain in a healthy way, right? They're not given the tools to do that, so they split and they just become these dogmatic, power hungry, maniacal people who are filled with vengeance. And James Baldwin said that he suspected that the reason why we cling to our bigotries and our hatreds is because we don't know how to deal with pain.
Yeah.
So the practice part is really trying to give people a tool, not just to deal with pain, but also to deal with pain.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. I mean, my all of those explanations of the pop culture and music references. I'm sitting here thinking, I want to. Your DEI trainings sound so much more fun than the ones that I've ever been to,
Yes.
and I'm thinking about how many times I've dragged my feet to one of them because I know I'm just
Mm-hmm.
going to be preached to and given tools that I'm not going to be able to use in my classroom because kids don't operate the way that they tell us they do.
Sure.
Kids are kind of immune to a lot of this bullshit because
Yeah.
they've not at that their age they are just kids and
Yeah.
they have all their needs are simpler. And so I'm thinking, and maybe this is the best way to transition into you talking to us a little bit on the way out about how we get your stuff, because of course in my
Sure.
school district I don't have the power to decide that we should do this kind of training instead of the one that we do.
Mm.
But it sounds like with your quests that you have, a person could access this type of training even as an individual. Is that kind of what dojo is?
Yes. So I talked about the Enchanted Games League, which is on the
Mm-hmm.
organizational business side, and Dojo is that, but for individuals themselves. So Dojo is an infinite game. It's a subscription-based game. You log in, you do a quest every day, and that's the game. And these quests are the quests that I described to you. Also, it's like a when you go onto the platform, it looks like a social media platform. So I'm posting in addition, by the way, I'm also doing the quest. Like I'm showing up and doing the quest every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to that, I'm posting pop culture references that are related to the quest of the day, right? So you're getting some of that exposure to the supporting materials, if you will. So yeah, I would definitely encourage people to go to enchanteddojo.com if they're interested. It's two D's, not one, so please be careful with the spelling. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if individuals want to start practicing and start bringing this way of being wherever they are into their workplace and conversations they have with family members. I know that oftentimes the feedback that we get from our partners is like, oh, I had to have a difficult conversation with my family over Thanksgiving, and this really helped me out. So it's like, it's 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 related to many different contexts and facets of our lives. And if folks want to get involved as individuals into the practice, enchanteddojo.com is the website to sign up.
That's great. It sounds kind of like guided journaling,
Mm-hmm.
but in public in the sense that you're doing it as part of a community.
Yeah, exactly. And you're doing it as part of a community, but it's a closed community, right? It's not as if
It's not
it's a closed
Facebook,
community. It's not Facebook, right? It's not
right?
Twitter. It's a closed
Mm-hmm.
community, and it has a telos, right? Facebook and Twitter have there's no point to meaning there's no like Twitter is a giant comment section, right? There's no actual uh aim
Endpoint.
or
Mm-hmm.
objective
Right.
Which is fun. I like Twitter just like I met you through Twitter, right? Like Twitter is useful, but it has no point
Right.
in the sense that we're talking about. Yeah,
Talking for the sake of talking. Yeah. Hmm.
exactly.
Right. Yeah. No, that all makes sense. And so, of course, on I will put links to all that stuff in the show notes, and I hope that we can, at the very least, inspire some people to think differently about what it means to have a diverse space, what it means to have an inclusive space, and of course, what it means to be human. Because ultimately, it has to start there, or else we're not going to get better at any of these things. Chloe, thank you so much for being here. Anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
Thank you for having me. If organizations are interested in bringing this stuff, check out theoryofenchantment.com. Our team will be in touch with you. You can also DM me on Twitter. I'm pretty easily accessible. The Twitter handle is at @cvaldary. So if you're interested, please be in touch. We're really trying to grow a community and change the way things are done out here. And there needs to be a change. Like, things are out of control. I don't know if you've noticed. It's out of control. And we want to build something better. So join us.
That's awesome. Very cool. Thank you, as always, for listening. On the way out, let's review the ways you can help this show survive for another 5 years. We're coming up on the 5-year anniversary in February of this show. Are we going to make it 5 more? Well, that depends on you in the audience. The things that I need you to do to help me survive. Go to Patreon and sign up for $3 a month. If the entire audience did that, I could probably do this job full time. That's one way you can help. $3 a month. It's a coffee. So chip in there. And of course, enter the Choralosophy checkout code at sightreadingfactory.com whenever you have the chance to do it. mymusicfolders.com, graphitepublishing.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com all take the Choralosophy discount code, which helps you and it also helps me. And of course, the other big things you can do are to help people see the show, like participate in social media conversation threads, share the episodes. All of these things are huge and help people find the show. When more people find the show, I'm able to do it easier and cover my expenses. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you will tune in next time as we keep the conversation going.